Today's episode is sponsored by my friends at the National Ranching Heritage Center in Lubbock, Texas. The National Ranching Heritage Center on the campus of Texas Tech University tells the story of ranching in the American West through over 50 historic structures. One of these structures is the Eclipse windmill. To the settler or roving cowboy, a windmill's creak and groan were a sign of life. It signified water. On the Texas South Plains, the wood-wheeled Eclipse, patented in 1867, was the windmill of choice. More than 300 furnished water for cattle and cowboys on the huge XIT ranch. Old-timers say the big 14-foot wheel was the only one that could get deep water. The Eclipse was invented by a Presbyterian minister working among Indians on Lake Superior. He had it working for 2 decades before the world discovered it. He patented the windmill in 1867 and then sold the patent to the Eclipse Windmill Company in 1873. The Eclipse was located in Sherman County, Texas, and restored for the National Ranching Heritage Center. The wooden wheel, sails, tail, and fan were recreated according to specifications in an old catalog. The Eclipse was used by the railroads as they built west across the Great Plains after the Civil War. The railroads needed water for the steam-powered engines. The exposed parts made it necessary for someone to climb the tall tower and grease the parts as often as once a week. You can see the Eclipse windmill in person at the National Ranching Heritage Center in Lubbock, Texas. You can check them out online at ranchingheritage.org. Come experience real ranches, real stories, real heritage at the National Ranching Heritage Center in Lubbock, Texas. I'd like to start today's show with a poem that was written by Texas rancher and faithful Cowboy Crossroads listener, Shad Sullivan. Shad wrote this for today's guest, Craig Haythorn, and it's entitled, A Private Applause. The old man's hands were just like his boots. Each were weathered and worn. When I came to his eyes, I knew he was different. Had been since the day he was born. His leathery palm clutched my hand. His strength overwhelmed me inside. He was brutally honest, said what he saw, and humility was his absolute pride. The figure 4 stitched boots peaked to his knees. The spurs were his working steel. His red cheeks were weathered, aged legs were bowed, and his character showed he was real. And as he sat on the bunk, I watched every move. He was deliberate in all of his style. Was this the man he dreamed of becoming when he was young and rode every mile? The wrecks he had danced in showed in his motion, yet determination appeared in his eyes. His days of cowboying had gone long and well. He's one of those old-timers with try. He isn't a talker or trader of sorts, just a cowboy with not much to say. One of those fellas whose actions spoke more. Handshakes and the truth are his way. Those weathered old hands lay a rest for his jaw. I watch as he studied the floor. The stir in his mind is what I wonder about. A young puncher's hero for sure. Well, he's ridden these hills for 70 years and can feel his time drawing near. So he'll snip a smile at all the things he has seen and give a wink to the man in the mirror. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy west and beyond. My guest today is Craig Haythorn. Craig Haythorn is a fourth-generation rancher from the famed Haythorn Land and Cattle Company in Arthur, Nebraska. The Haythorn Land and Cattle Company was the inaugural winner of the American Quarter Horse Association's Best Remuda Award. Craig has received many awards and honors in the horse and ranching world, including the Foy Proctor Memorial Cowman's Award, Western Horseman's Horseman of the Year, and the National Golden Spur Award. In 2013, he was inducted into the Nebraska Sandhills Cowboy Hall of Fame. I sat down with Craig at the National Ranching Heritage Center in Lubbock, Texas, and recorded this interview. Here's Craig Haythorn.
Well, originally my great-granddad came from England, and he was a stowaway on a ship. He wanted to get married at 15 years old, and the family didn't want him to get married. He got mad, so he got on a ship coming to America, and it was full of Hereford bulls. Well, he was at sea about 5 days before they found him. Well, they couldn't take him back, so they came to supposedly in the Galveston area, and he took care of bulls all the way over here. And then he went to work for the man that was receiving the Hereford bulls. And I've never known what the family's name was, but that's where he originally came to. And he later came up the Texas Trail 4 times, and the last time he settled in Ogallala and had a livery barn. And then several years later, he moved to Arthur, which is 37 miles north of Ogallala, and homesteaded there. And then he worked for a neighboring ranch, rode home on the weekends, which was about 15 miles, stayed Sunday, and then probably came home Saturday evening and then rode back over there Sunday night. For years there, a man named Yeast ran a lot of that country, leased it and owned a lot of it. And he worked for that man as a wagon boss. And that's how he kind of got started, took wages in cattle, and my great-grandmother cooked for the men if they were close to there, But later that Yeast family moved to Canada, and there's still Yeast people in Canada. But that's kind of how he originally got his start. And then, I don't know the actual year, but he took 2 or 3 men with him and went to Oregon and bought 500 horses and trailed them back from Oregon back to Nebraska because he had a contract with the Rosebud Indian Reservation in South Dakota. They broke a lot of them to work and broke a lot of them to ride, but he already had them sold, and so they would come and inspect them. And that was another facet of the family, how he got going, But anyway, the family's been there 140 years. He had 2 sons, Harry Jr. and Walt was my granddad. Waldo was my dad. And Hazel was my grandmother. They only had 1 child, and that was my dad. So, and then his brother, Harry Jr., Walt and Harry married sisters. And then their 2 sons married sisters. So that's the reason my family has never had a lot of relation, because 2 generations married sisters. So it never branched out much until my sons, and of course they didn't marry sisters, so it's kind of branched out since then. But the first 2 generations born here married sisters.
In an interview with the National Ranching Heritage Center, Craig Haythorn once said this: "It was born and bred in me. That's all I ever wanted to do, was ride a horse, cowboy, and be as good a hand as I could be, and never had any desire to do anything else."
I think well, I was 3 or 4 years old. I knew what I wanted to do. I built toy ranches, played with animals all the time, carried the rope around all the time, started going horseback when I was like 4 and 5 years old. When I was 10, I was roping a lot, was competing when I was like 13, 14 years old. Amateur associations and even single steer ropings when I was that young. So, been involved in horses, cattle, all my life. That's all I ever wanted to do was ranch.
There's never a consideration of another career.
No, sir. Never was. Never was.
Did you grow up with your father and your grandfather, spending a lot of time with them and time working with them?
Very true. And I have a sister 2 years older than I am. When she got out of high school, well, my mother, the little town where I'm originally from, Arthur, is about 100 people. Well, my mom, when we got through the 4th grade, she thought we needed a little better education, so we moved to Ogallala and eventually built a home there. Well, when my sister got out of high school, my mother lived in Ogallala and my dad was at the ranch, and they were back and forth, and that wasn't it's 37 miles to the ranch. It just wasn't a good thing for them, so the last 3 years, sophomore, junior, and senior, I lived with my grandparents because at that time they were living in Ogallala. So I'd stay with them probably 3 nights a week, and a lot of times I drove home Wednesday night, but that was great because I got to be around my granddad a lot. And at that time, we had a big barn in the east end of Ogallala, and I'd go down there and ride colts, or in the spring, I'd start roping calves. There was an arena there also, but he'd buy calves for me, and I'd rope all spring, getting ready to go to high school rodeos, but that was a great thing to be around my grandparents that much at that age, And then I was around my granddad. He was still riding and roping when he would have been in his late 70s, I guess. Probably not as much as I still do, I try and be a horseback about every day, but he was a good cowman, good cowboy, and my dad was too. Learned from both of them. Anybody that I thought was a good hand, you can learn something from everybody. There's good points about most people. He was very good to me, my granddad was. We had a horrible blizzard in 1975. Killed 750 calves for the ranch. When he called me, he couldn't get to the highway with a vehicle, so he said, "I'll meet you at the road." And I said, "Okay, I'll lope over there to the road and meet you." So I loped over there, and he goes, "How'd you get along?" I said, "Not very good, Granddad, it's bad." He said, "Well, how many did you lose?" I said, "Well, we spent 2 days as a team in the wagon picking them up. We have 333 dead ones here in one pile." And I said, "I know they lost calves at North Ranch, and they lost calves where my dad lived, where Dad lives." I said, "I'm guessing we lost 700 calves." He said, sat there a minute, he goes, "It could have been worse. Could have killed the cows." Now that's optimistic. So I guess that it leaves, things could be worse. Things are bad sometimes. They are, and they don't go good, but about always it could be worse. So,
did he talk about other, experiences like that, bad winters and
13, 31, and 49 were three of the worst winters ever in the Sandhills, Nebraska. In 31, they had a bunch of 2-year-old horses south of the home ranch, about a mile and a half. Well, they were, working with cattle and everything, and they never got over there the snow was, of course I wasn't there, but snow, they said, was about 3 foot deep, and you couldn't get hardly anywhere unless you were horseback or a team, They finally got over there, and those colts had got into a kind of a ravine, not a rocky ravine, and they couldn't get out. And they ate all the manes and tails off of themselves. They could eat snow, for moisture, but they ate all their manes and tails off. And my granddad broke a trail down in there, and they followed him out. But I'll never forget that story. They all lived, but he said they were a hideous sight for about a year till their manes and tails grew back out. The Sandhills had never really been a real droughty country. 2011, it was pretty dry. I'm 77, and we've only moved cows once in my life. And the cattle we kept at home looked better than the ones we sent away, but we've only moved cattle once in my life. And my granddad, I don't think he ever moved any cattle, or my dad. That's quite a statement that, Texas went through the 50s and 7-year drought and everything. We've never had that, been very blessed. Well, probably the most unique thing about Sandhills is that's where the Ogallala Aquifer starts, Comes all the way to Texas, but water is easily available there. We still have windmills that are 30, 40 feet deep is all, And basically, it's sand, but it has a sod cover, but that sod's only about 2 inches thick. So you have to be a steward of the land. If you tear that sod off or over-abuse it or anything, you're going to have lots of sand and blowouts, what they call them, But it's one of the greatest cow countries, I think, in the world. You got to put up with some winter, yes, but we were just talking about there's never been an extended drought there. Water is easily available, good grasses, and a lot of those valleys north of Ogallala, and then the further north you go, they get bigger and wetter. Those valleys are sub-irrigated, like you can hit water with post hole diggers. Well, those are all what they call hay meadows, and that's where all the hay comes from in Nebraska, is those wet valleys. But you get more of it the further north you go towards South Dakota. We're kind of on the southern end of it. But and the hills get bigger the further north you go. They're kind of rolling country, kind of like around Canadian, and then that country towards the south end of it. But most of the Sandhills are basically north of I-80, and I can't remember the acres, but they kind of go to Lexington, Nebraska, and north to South Dakota. All of that country would be considered the Sandhills. And there's different versions of it, like the northwest corner is a little harder ground and shorter grass, a little harder, less rain, but real strong grass. They get places they can get 2.5, 3 pounds gain on a yearling in that country. And then it just goes all the way across probably to O'Neill, Nebraska, which is east of Valentine, 100 miles. But that whole country is what they call the Sandhills. When I got home from college, it would have been December of '69, and I was there at the home ranch with Dad for a couple months riding colts and whatever. And my granddad drove up one morning. He always drove a Chrysler car. He drove 34 of them in a row, traded every other year. And people were standing in line to get them, I mean, he and my dad were the opposite. Took vehicles, kept track of them, immaculate, oil, and my dad was complete opposite. But anyway, he got out of his car. He was carrying a checkbook. He walked over to me and he handed it to me. He said, "You just well move to Ackley Valley and get started." Got back in his car and drove off. So my dad was over at the shop. I said, "Well, Granddad just showed up, gave me a checkbook, told me to move to Ackley Valley." He said, "Yeah, I knew that was coming." So anyway, it's always been all run together as Haythorn Land Cattle Company. But my granddad kind of run the southern end of it, and my dad ran the north two ranches. And it was the right thing to do, not that my dad and I ever had any words, or my granddad, but my granddad would have been, he was close to 80, I suppose. So anyway, I moved to the South Ranches, which is called Ackley Valley, and lived in a little bunkhouse there. And just started from there and went on, So I was probably groomed from a young age to eventually take control of everything. And at that time, I had my granddad and my dad, So it was pretty hard to make a very bad mistake because they were watching,
In 1992, the Haythorn Land and Cattle Company was selected as the inaugural winner of the American Quarter Horse Association's Best Remuda Award. In a book about the various recipients of that award entitled Best Remudas, Jim Jennings wrote this about the Haythorns. Having plenty of horses has always been important to the Haythorns, beginning back around the turn of the 20th century when Harry took the train to Oregon and came back to Nebraska driving 500 head of horses. Haythorn Land and Cattle Company had the first registered horses in Nebraska, and today registers more horses with AQHA than anyone else in the United States.
Well, see, my granddad probably started the horse deal. He supposedly had the first registered quarter horse in Nebraska. He was a stud called Sport. And back then, they even showed horses at Halter and stuff like that, That's the reason that barn was in Ogallala. They kept show horses there and everything. Eventually kind of got away from that. My dad and his double cousin, Howard Haythorn, they roped calves for years, then they rode cutting horses for years, and then they roped steers for years. So the horse deal evolved from both sides of the family, but my granddad probably originally started it, and his brother was very involved too. Both of them rode bucking horses, roped, bulldogged. They even had rodeo stock a long time ago. Fact is, a lot of their bucking horses were hay horses. Back then, everybody hayed with horses. You mowed with horses, raked with horses, swept, stacker. They probably worked 40, 50 horses a day, but a lot of them were those bucking horses. That was before my time, but that was included in the horse deal. So, horses have been a major part of my family's life for years.
I know y'all became involved in the AQHA, and when did that involvement come along? And
Well, my dad and granddad both were directors, late 40s, early 50s, and then my dad judged a bunch in 50s, 60s, and 70s. Even put on seminars for AQHA, traveled all over the United States, put on horse seminars for people. He judged a lot, my dad did. He really did. Probably helped further the family name, in the quarter horse industry. My dad was a real people person, my granddad, and was pretty quiet and reserved. And I was for a long time. I've worked on it all my life to become more outgoing, with people and everything. And I think the older you get, you appreciate people more than when you're young, But that's kind of the involvement. And then granddad's kind of started it. My dad kind of made it bigger. And when I got home, my granddad kind of turned the horse deal over to me. And, I bought a stud when I was in college. So I guess in my early 20s, I became very involved with the quarter horse part of it and was very interested in it, and just furthered it, I guess, and numbers. At one time, we were up to 250 mares. But, so much work, takes so many people, and finally started, downsizing. And 1 year we had 21 studs turned loose, but we were raising draft horses and saddle horses, at the time. At one time, we probably had 150 draft horses, Probably in the mid-'80s, we probably had 1,000 horses on the 4 ranches. But started downsizing,
Until fairly recently, Craig Haythorn still fed every day with a team of horses. In a 2009 interview with Western Horseman, he commented, "Using a team saves on fuel and it's good for the horses. Yeah, it's not as fast. That's the problem with America. People are going too fast."
Well, when I came home from school, basically in 1970, everybody fed with horses, and then it just started getting further away from a lot of people, and tractors and Caterpillars and everything. But we never changed until, 2010 maybe. 2010, 2012, we were still feeding with horses. Yeah, we were there in the 90s, early 2000s. We'd work 45 to 50 every day, every morning, cake teams and feed teams. I love a horse. It doesn't mean never sees a draft horse or a saddle horse, I love a horse. I love those teams just as much as a good saddle horse. But I could go feed 800 harness, go feed 800 cows, be home and unharnessed most of the time at 10:30. We still feed kind of the same way, and those guys get home at 11, 11:30, 12, So it was easy for me to do. My boys kind of wanted to change, and, I think I quit about 4 years ago, but I fed till we had a guy leave at the South Ranch. And I asked my dad, I said, "Well, should I just start feeding?" And he goes, "Yeah, I guess you just will." So, I'd have been around it all my life, So I started feeding, and then an older friend of mine that still lives in Nebraska, I'd go stay with him 2 or 3 days, when he always started feeding before I did, and got tips and stuff from him, you know. He was probably the greatest guy with a team I've ever seen in my life. And I spent a lot of time with him. And I talked to him a lot on the phone. I mean, he could tell you, you know, I'd say, hey, this horse works good, but he likes to work with his head to the inside, you know. He said, well, just take you a little short strap, hook it to the outside of your hame, hook it to the outside of your bit to where you can't turn over. You know, just little things like that. And we're still great friends, but he's probably the greatest hand I ever saw with the workhorse. About everything with voice command, you know. Very seldom touched the lines. And for 30 years, I guess, I never hardly drove a team when I was pulling a load of hay on, just voice commands. Stop them anytime you wanted to. You know, they're out there 80 feet from where you're talking to them, you know. It's very rewarding, relaxing to me. I enjoyed feeding. I really did.
Do you feel like those skills and that knowledge will just be lost with so many people getting away from that?
I don't know anybody that feeds that way anymore. I was probably about the last one to quit. Both my boys could feed, but they weren't real interested in it. They wanted to go to bales instead of haystacks. And it takes a lot more help to put up haystacks, you know. Whereas baling, 2 or 3 people can put up a lot of hay, you know. So that was a reason, you know, takes less people, less monetary value into putting the hay up and everything. But I miss the workhorses, I do.
I think I've read or maybe heard in another interview that till fairly recently that y'all would still bring a wagon out.
Yeah, we ran wagon probably for 30 years and haven't the last 3 years, I think. But my grandson, he's 8. Well, he's talking a little about a team, and he'd like to go on the wagon. So,
if you would tell me, you know, what did that process look like when you were taking a wagon out, and were you hiring a cook, and were you staying out on the wagon for many weeks at a time, or
well,
you know, what was kind of your routine?
We stayed probably 3 weeks. Most of the time was 3 weeks. To me, it was. I mean, I really enjoyed it. Yeah, we always we had several cooks. Jimbo cooked for us. You know, that's one great thing about last year. Jimbo was the cowboy. You know, we've known each other. I've known Jimbo when he was probably 12, 13 years old. When I was going to Tech, I went to the Pitchforks a lot and worked on the weekends or vacations. Instead of driving 600 miles home, I'd just go down there and work, you know. So that was a neat deal that he and I got to go in together.
You probably had people who were cowboys anxious to work for you in those days. It seemed like there's a lot of those guys that they're looking for those places that were still pulling a wagon out and, you know, wanting to have that experience and get to live and work that way.
One of the greatest assets my family's ever had is the people that work for us. I've had some great people that work for us. And a lot of young boys came there and worked, you know, anywhere from 2 to 10, 15 years, you know, and then later went out on their own and made something that makes you feel proud.
Are there any of those that stand out, cowboys that have worked for you over the years that you would like to talk about?
Well, I don't want to leave anybody out, but Jerry Buckles, Paul Cleveland, Larry Hinksler, and we just buried the boy that worked for us for 48 years about a month ago, John Pifo. Jerry Soon, Lonnie Smith. Years ago, he was older than I was, but he was kind of a mentor of mine. He was the foreman at the North Ranch for my dad, and he took very good care of me. His name was Floyd Barker. And then another guy came there and worked 14 years. His name was Mort Hunt, and we lost him probably 20 years ago. But he was one of my first mentors, taught me how to bulldog. And that when I was young, my dad was roping steers a lot. So like Clark McIntyre, Crude, old guys that were, cowboys and good hands. They came there a lot, spent time with my dad. Reba was a little kid when she came there, So, I had mentors from the time I was young, took tips from them, and they'd come there and rope and help me and everything, So I've had a blessed life, blessed. Well, I don't think it's just my ability. I think it's the whole family, I guess the desire for ranching, the love of the land, the cattle, the horses, all of it, Every generation, I think, is devoted their life to that industry. Now, when I get talking about family, I might get a little sentimental, so.
That's okay.
But anyway, I think that's one of the biggest things. And we, like everybody, have had challenges. Markets are low. What do we do now and stuff like that, But we've always stayed together, made plans together, and still do, and been blessed that both of my sons came home. Most people can't get one to come home. Both of mine came home.
They have the same love for it that you do, obviously.
Yes, sir. Cord's probably more into the cattle end of it and business, and Sage is more into the horse end of it and the cattle too. It's a mixture of both, but it's a great melting pot because they work for each other, Very blessed to have them. One of the biggest changes in the Sandhills has been the hay production. Everybody used to put up haystacks. Now they've gone to bales. It takes less help. Nobody works as many men today as they did 30 years ago. You just, four-wheelers have done I'm not recommending them, but, it's, a lot of people aren't as horse-minded as my family or other families, and I don't blame them at all. You do what you have to do with what you have financially or whatever, but four-wheelers have changed a lot. The way the hay production is in the Sandhills, I'd say that two of the main things. Our weather hasn't. Our winters probably aren't as severe as they have been in the past, and that's a plus. still gets cold there. We have snow, but years ago, they talk about, 2 and 3 feet. We just don't get that snow anymore. We may get 6, 8 inches, but usually when we get a snow, we maybe get wind with it. It'll blow the tops or those ridges off, and they can still graze, We still try and run a lot of cows on grass and cake instead of feeding them all the time, Economically, if you look at a cow, what you put in her, hay and protein, is the biggest expense there is in ranching industry. So, if you can run her on grass and cake versus some people in our country probably feed 6, 7 months of the year, but we primarily feed when we're calving, in the spring. You can put a lot of things into a cow that, they didn't do it 100 years ago. Why do we have to do it today, We used to calve in February and March. Takes more feed, because you're feeding them earlier. But today's markets, a 400-pound calf will almost bring as much as a 600-pound calf, dollar-wise, and you haven't not put in near as much expense in that 400-pound calf. We calve later. We still have calves that weigh 5 1/4 and 550. Our first calf heifers calves bring within $100 of the bigger calves, and a lot less input in them. That's been a big change probably in the last 8 or 10 years. There's those smaller calves go to wheat or, stuff like that, and those bigger calves, probably not many of them will go to be yearlings. They'll eventually go to the feedlot, but things like that. Seems like every 10 years kind of things change. But that's been real noticeable to me is a 400-pound calf will almost bring us $1 million as a big calf, Probably the biggest change, I think, in the last 20 years is hands-on families. A lot of the ranches have gone to corporations or they're out of families anymore. That's the biggest change I think we've seen in the ranching industry. Old family ranches are getting fewer and fewer, and a lot of it is the son never came back. There's a lot of things probably that are more financially rewarding than the ranch industry, but true ranch people, I don't think, we're all interested in money, have enough to provide for our family or ranch or whatever, but it's the lifestyle, I think, that the older ranch families that are still ranching with the same family pedigrees, lineage, that it's not the money, it's what you have in your heart for the land and what you can do to help your family, But it's changed a lot in the last 20 years. And my generation, when we're gone, it might even be scarier because a lot of people, 40s and 50s, they're not back in the ranching industry. They've gone on to different lifestyles and occupations, So it is kind of scary what's going to happen,
In 2023, Craig Haythorn was the recipient of the prestigious National Golden Spur Award. On the day of our interview, Craig was in Lubbock, Texas to attend the 2024 National Golden Spur Awards, where his friend T.O. Clayberg would be receiving the same award. I asked Craig how it felt to be a recipient of the National Golden Spur Award.
You know, I've won some awards prior to that. Every one of them's been an honor, but this is probably the greatest award I've ever won. And when Jim Brett called me, I thought, oh, they're trying to raise money for something or something, you know. And I was a horseback moving some cows. And I just kind of kept waiting. He said, well, you're the 2023 45th recipient of the Golden Spur Award. And there was a big pause, and I said, well, Jim Brett, I said, either that board is damn confused or you have run out of recipients. But anyway, he kind of got a kick out of that. But I thought about it all summer, you know. How could I be in there with those other 44 people? I don't know if I'm qualified to be in there. I really did. I thought about that all summer and got through the award and everything, but means so much to me. And I went to school here, and that's one reason I'm back here tonight. T.O. and I lived on the same floor together in the dorm here. And Buzzy Thorpe, I've known for 60 years. He's been like a father to me. Wonderful man. So that's the reason I'm back here. Everybody wants to be remembered, but probably I work every day trying to be the best man I can be, whether it's for the ranching industry, agriculture. Good Lord, I try every day to be as good a person as I can be. And so I'd like to be remembered for that. A good cowboy, good hand with a horse, all of those things. And I'm not worried about my future generations to come. Those two boys are very qualified. And it wasn't just me that made them that way. It was my dad, my granddad, and my great-granddad. I think it came from all four of us. I'm proud of that.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Craig Haythorn for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Craig and Haythorn Land and Cattle Company at haythorn.com. I'd like to thank the National Ranching Heritage Center in Lubbock, Texas for sponsoring this episode. You can find out more about them at ranchingheritage.org. I'd like to thank Hal Cannon for playing the Cowboy Crossroads theme music. You can find out more about Hal at halcannon.com. I'd like to thank my Trail Boss patrons Bob Kelly, Chris Ryden, Scott Anderson, and Paige Marie Polis for their support of this episode. If you're enjoying Cowboy Crossroads and would like to help me keep it going, you can become a patron at patreon.com/Cowboy Crossroads. That's patreon.com/Cowboy Crossroads. You can also make a donation on my website at andyhedges.com. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.